Hello, this is Rod Monte,
And this is Cody Matushik.
and we are the movie reviewers. And today we are going to be discussing something that doesn't exist anymore, which are sci-fi action comedies like you had in the 1980s. A lot of them were focused on teenage audiences. And let's talk a little bit about the 1980s in terms of the movie-going audience in that time period. This was really the time period when a lot of the people who grew up in the 1950s watching 1950s sci-fi movies grew to adulthood to take over the industry. The industry at this time was in a unique place. The old studio system of the 1950s and 60s had basically disappeared. And by late 1960s into the 70s and 80s, the audience was not older now, they were younger, they were teenagers. So films were starting to be produced in the 1970s and 80s to appeal to a more teenage-oriented audience and talk about teenage experiences. And this included comedies. And so the 1980s itself, particularly with the space race still going on, you had things like with Challenger and things like that going on, there was an element amongst people in their 30s and their 40s and 50s, in that age group, who were starting to do films that were trying to recapture some of that scientific exploration of the 50s, but using it to appeal to a 1980s teenage audience. This is a time period of Reagan and Reaganomics. This is a time period where self-satisfaction, self-interest, individualism was reaching peak levels. And so what you see a lot in these comedies is people focused on their own destiny, not for the betterment of mankind, but the betterment of self-interest. And particularly, what's better than that than they felt teenagers. So part of what we'll do is we're going to look at these sci-fi comedies and see how audiences have changed. Because a lot of the stars that were possible in the 1980s, Andrew McCarthy, people like that, Molly Ringwald, people like that, are impossible in today's audience because today's audience wants a different type of comedic experience. Many of the comedians who play to audiences today who are teenagers are people in their 40s and 50s. So you look at movies like Central Intelligence with Kevin Hart and The Rock. You look at Hot Tub Time Machine, that has comedians who are in their 40s, 50s, in some cases the 60s. You have Zombieland 1 and Zombieland 2. These are people, a lot of them, who are just adults, not teenagers. Teenagers don't have a big landscape anymore as actors in comedic films. You just don't see them anymore. Romantic comedies, sci-fi comedies, anything like that, just would be proliferated with a much more older acting body. And the sci-fi comedies of the 1980s in particular have become extinct. And we want to talk about why that is in today's world, but also take a look back at what was defining the genre back then. And like I said, a lot of the people who had grown up in the space race, the 50s and 60s, were now trying to recapture some of that magic in the 1980s before 1980s contemporary audience, okay? So we're going to start talking about these sci-fi comedies in the 1980s and what were the characteristics that made them up. And Cody's going to talk a little bit about that.
At that time, there was such films such as Ghostbusters, Weird Science, Back to the Future, Spaceballs. They Live, and Critters. What these movies had that made them so different from today is they actually took elements that the writers at the time said, I'm really fascinated by this. Let me look into this and see if I can make up these zany situations that these characters can live in and actually interact in. The best part is, a lot of these were grounded in actual current day comedy like Ghostbusters. It is a complete blue-collar comedy show. Basically, it related to everyday people of the working class.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly what's interesting about these sci-fi films is that they still are holding on to this kind of science of the future kind of dream about what was possible, except a lot of them are for their own self-interest. Ghostbusters is about making a business, about capturing ghosts and making money and fame off of it. Okay, Weird Science is about these teenagers creating the perfect woman for their own self-interest, okay? And one thing which you'll notice as we get into some of these comedies is, like I said, there's the self-interested motivation of these characters, but there's also that they still engage in the level of pseudoscience that the guys in the 50s and 60s do. I mean, they still do that, lots of very strange sounds and knobs and looking things. I mean, what are the basic what are the basic kind of plot lines you see in a lot of these movies centered around, would you say? If you had to generalize, what would you say?
Usually romance or failed experiment.
It certainly, what's also interesting about this is that there are still a lot of the stereotypes that you see out of, like, 60s comedies, too.
Oh, yes.
I mean, one thing you see if you watch films like, for example, Weird Science, came out in 1985, or My Science Experiment, which came out around the same time period, is that there is this nerd culture that's always on the outs, looking through redemption through science. But what's interesting is that science serves as more of a vehicle for them to get their own redemption. It doesn't really serve as a central plot point. In other words, there's very little science in the sci-fi comedy. I mean, is that fair to say?
That is correct. Plus, it was a complete misunderstanding of how the internet is going to work in the future.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, which oftentimes happens. But we're going to take a closer look at some of the sci-fi comedies. Like I said, with some of the chief characteristics of these comedies include self-interest, redemption, but also something to take a look at is try to consider the comedies in context to the time period in which they're created. Okay, let's start with, why don't we just start with Ghostbusters? We look at Ghostbusters. It's released in '84. It's directed by Ivan Reitman, starring some of the top comedians from the 70s. In fact, not from the 80s, from the 70s, okay? And why do I say that? What's the distinction, okay? One of the top comedians in the 1980s would be Eddie Murphy. He's nowhere to be found here. Okay, Richard Pryor does a lot of comedies in the 80s. He's nowhere to be found here. Okay, there's many top-flight comedians. Robin Williams, not found here. But you have basically a whole array of comedy writers coming out of the 60s and 70s, Saturday Night Live in particular, who are making huge waves here. That include Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd. And the film doesn't really center around science. I mean, what role does science play in Ghostbusters?
Basically, the only role that science plays is the parapsychology aspect of it.
Well, from what standpoint?
Basically, the Harold Ramis character is trying to find a way, working with Dan Aykroyd, to go, okay, we can prove there's ghosts. We know that they're there. Let's find a way to see them. Let's find a way to capture them and make money off of it.
And what's interesting about this is that the film itself does not extol knowledge or scientific knowledge, education, or expertise. In fact, the film starts off mocking people who are scientific experts, people with expertise. It starts out where? I mean, it starts out in
Columbia.
Starts out at Columbia University, and basically what happens, and these are slight spoilers for those of you who have not seen the movies, but these movies are 30 years old at this point, guys, so how much can we really spoil? But basically they're kicked down their ear because they're considered losers in the scientific community.
Yep,
okay,
and it actually starts with Bill Murray being a PhD parapsychologist.
Well, only in a movie would that be possible. I mean,
oh, true story.
But that's the thing, is that the movie itself it views science as a MacGuffin. Sci-fi comedies are not about the science, they're about the comedy. The science is used as a MacGuffin to achieve that end. But a lot of these films, and Ghostbusters is a good example of that, is that these are redemption films also. It's for people who are down and out, who feel lost, who feel like they're losers, finding redemption through superiority. And science has always been viewed, science and technology are oftentimes viewed as means by which to achieve some sort of greatness. They're vehicles to achieve some sort of power. And the 84 is important because in the year by 84, in the Reagan era, we're in the midst of a terrible recession. Many people were out of work and couldn't even afford education in terms of college and grad school and things like that. And the people who had those things were very secure in their jobs, and there seemed to be a real disconnect between those in higher education and those on the outside of it. And the film is highlighting that. And the science, which you would think would be a means by which to elevate one's prospects, is really used as a MacGuffin by which somebody can fulfill their own ambitions, and in this case, greed. Which is make this interesting because, again, despite the fact that you have Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd as the kind of scientists of the group of Ghostbusters, quote unquote, they basically still have blue collar personalities. They smoke, they drink, hit on women. They have this blue collar personality, and what you see very little in the film is them engaging as scientists. And this is interesting because this is a counterpoint to the later movie. The later movie that was a remake wants to try to show that the women in that movie are intelligent and successful in achievement. The original film doesn't try to do that. It just basically allows you the conceit that these are smart men, you know? And so the film is just about them achieving success by being smart. The science is a MacGuffin by which to be successful, you know, as people in the midst of a recession in New York City, which was deeply in debt, a lot of people out of work, you know, it's a working class comedy, essentially. And so that's a lot of the science is in that. I mean, what else do you see? How does the science, however, relate to the comedy within Ghostbusters?
It, honestly, it's all in the gear that they are using. With the proton packs.
Right, again, it's the technology. The technology which goes virtually unexplained.
Yes.
But what's great about the technology is it's very marketable.
Yes.
In other words, simple ideas, simple terms that can be reproduced for kids and for toys, for commercial value. The proton packs. I still remember the proton packs. Remember when they were selling the proton packs?
Oh, I remember. I had one.
Oh, there you go. I mean, they were huge hits, you know, and the costumes and everything. So, again, the science doesn't matter. The prestige of being a scientist doesn't matter. The intelligence, the discipline, the hard work of being a scientist doesn't matter. I guess here's a question. You take a movie like, and this is, I guess, a difficult question to answer in a way, but does a film like this do a disservice to people in the scientific community or not?
I don't believe it does, because anyone intelligent watching this goes, I'm really curious what that type of scientist does. Let me actually research it.
So you think it was inspirational?
I believe that it could have been.
Okay. I mean, it's possible, certainly. I mean, I think of a film, because I think of shows like Star Trek, which again are more almost sci-fantasy than they are science fiction, though they veer towards science fiction because ultimately a lot of those devices found grounding within American society and in the scientific community, including the cellular phone. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest ones, the flip phones.
Yes.
You know, and, I mean, by the way, amongst others too, you know?
Yeah, the EMPs.
The EMPs, okay? The use of laser technology. Okay, as an applicable weapon, which does actually exist. The Navy does have, quote unquote, for want of a better term, laser guns that send out a high beam light that can destroy a target.
Yes,
they do exist. So, you know, Ghostbusters you would say is inspirational, but you look at something like the ghosts in Ghostbusters that get captured and all that, and it also seems like it's a vehicle not just for the comedy, but for the commentary. And that's something we're definitely going to get into, is that these films are very much of their time. And let me be very specific what I mean. Is that they're responding to issues and concerns germane to that time period. I think that's fair to say. Right?
Oh, yes, definitely.
I mean, a lot of these films, and what's weird about these films is that they're social commentaries then, and they're different social commentaries now. At the time, Ghostbusters was seen as a kid's movie.
Oh, yes.
It was a kid's romp. But now, if you go back as an adult, what you're really watching is a working class comedy of people who are using science and technology as a means by which to achieve their own ends. And that's something that, with the proliferation of everyday technology that we have, that you don't have to, you can be a neophyte and still use a lot of the scientific technology, software and all that, and you don't really have to know anything. Because there are instructions available, there are guides available, there are video guides available. We have YouTube, science. We don't need science, I have instructions. I mean, and so there's an interesting element there where it's like, with the proliferation of technology in the 21st century, what you see with Ghostbusters is the working class man having access to that technology and what he might do with it. And that is that he might use it for his own self-aggrandizement, for his own self-interest, but in a way to make a living. And what's interesting about that, of course, is the role the city plays in that.
Yes. And basically, all these guys were fired from their previous jobs, and they were looking for a way to make a living. And the only way they could do that was to charge people for their services.
Which is what they did. And by the way, who are they charging? But who are they charging? Let's talk about that.
Hotel owners and the city of New York.
In other words, the corporations and the state. In other words, the people who can afford their services. In other words, they're trying to soak the rich. They're trying to soak the people who have the money. I mean, is that fair to say?
Oh, that's fair to say.
They don't, because you never see. It's not like they're in the Bronx, in the projects in the Bronx, in those Latino neighborhoods, going there to help clear out the local bodega. I mean, they're
no, they rarely did a private residence.
The one private residence they do is, of course, Sigourney Weaver's residence. And do you remember what her profession?
She was a musician.
She was a cellist.
Yes.
A well-paid cellist in New York City. With their own apartment. So, I mean, that's something to keep in mind when you look at these scientific comedies. These sci-fi comedies were a means not just to engage in humor, but a type of social commentary about the time period. Now, what's interesting is that in retrospect, as we watch these films, some of the commentary is very, very negative. And I think one of the films, which we'll get into, and I don't know how you're going to feel, like, we don't discuss these much beforehand, guys. So when we talk about some of these and our opinions agree or disagree, that's very genuine because we don't actually discuss, we know the movies we're going to discuss, but we don't actually talk about how we each feel about it because we want to do that right on air with you guys. But the film Weird Science, John Hughes. I mean, what's your opinion of this movie?
Sexist. It is very sexist.
Not at all. What's the premise?
It is two guys that are trying to create a perfect girl using a Barbie and the internet so that they can bend her to her will to have the perfect girlfriend.
So basically, science being used for dehumanization.
Exactly.
And sexualization of an individual. Basically to make her a sex slave.
Yes, that's exactly what they used her
I mean,
for.
that's really... by the way, interesting that's coming from John Hughes. Mr. 16 Candles John Hughes.
Yes, because he's always written such fabulous women roles in many of his movies.
Are you being sarcastic or are you being real? I can't tell sometimes.
I am actually being real because look at 16 Candles, look at Breakfast Club. Those were actually strong, well-written women.
We're going to talk about teenage comedies in the future, guy, and we're going to talk about Breakfast Club and 16 Candles, and I have big bones to pick with these kind of comedies, though I'm a big fan of The Breakfast Club, not so much 16 Candles. I just can't get into it. But we have to question. I do have that question about how well written they are about the teenage experience. But that's something we'll get into. Okay, but basically, Weird Science, again, uses science as a MacGuffin. And now, this is one aspect I want to talk about. Is that the audience of the 1980s were predominantly teenagers. Teenagers get varied maybe from 12 to maybe 18 or 19 years old. Those were the biggest demographic you were looking for. Okay, that's who you shot for, okay? And so sex plays a very common role. And sex and science are prolific in the 1980s. Is that fair enough to say?
Oh, yes, very much so.
That science is again used for one's self-interest. In this case, for one's sexual gratification. What's interesting about this movie is that, it deals with the teenager. The teenager in this case, and the teenagers in this case, I should say, are people who feel alienated from their own world.
Yep.
They feel alienated from society, so they want to feel valued. And they feel the only means to achieve that is through the creation of somebody who will innately find value within them. Is that fair enough to say?
That's exactly right. They are looking for the perfect 10 to make people like one of the characters' brothers, who was played by Bill Paxton, jealous.
Essentially, yeah. That's exactly it.
Look, I'm a nerd. I have this hot girlfriend. What can you say?
I mean, the film is basically... It takes, first of all, several assumptions. It says that science is reserved for those who are socially alienated. That's clear. We see that in Ghostbusters, or in Weird Science, Back to the Future. I mean, we got tons of movies. We see that in, okay? Science is reserved for those who are socially alienated and have no social skills. What's interesting about today, and it's hard, I think, for people to understand today, particularly if you grew up as what's called the millennial generation, is how not in it was to be into what was called geek culture. Where geek culture now has prolific impact upon the mainstream that's no longer considered to be outsider. To be a geek meant to be a social outsider. Judd Apatow made his early career on the social alienation of outsiders, of people who were considered to be socially dysfunctional or functionally non-sociable. Or dysfunctionally non-social. I mean, the whole thing. And that's the thing about Weird Science, is that Weird Science upholds that idea. That science is the realm of the socially alienated and the virgin.
Yes.
because people who have sex are not socially dysfunctional. Yeah, I know. Yeah, read the history of Casanova. Tell me if you still think that. Anyway, yeah, right. But I mean, that's the thing, is that the science within that, they take this Barbie doll, they want to create a sexual object upon which to unleash all their fantasies, and that's a metaphor I never want to hear again coming out of my mouth. But, I mean, that's the thing, is that it's used again, that 1980s way of the me generation of self-interest and self-aggrandizement, okay? And what makes this even more pernicious, I would argue, you talked about being sexist, is they cast Kelly LeBrock.
Yes.
Now, to me, this is interesting. I mean, what do you know about Kelly LeBrock? You remember?
Actually, I don't remember much. I remember that she was an underwear model for a while.
She was an underwear model, and she's also not American. Let's mention that, okay? She's actually she's born in American, but she's born in America, but she was raised actually in England, so she had an English accent, and oftentimes she played the object of sexual obsession of male figures. She was in The Woman in Red with Gene Wilder. Okay, she oftentimes played that sexy, quote unquote, sexy character. Okay, and she did a series of the girlfriend for Steven Seagal, right? Yeah.
Yep.
In Hard to Kill and whatever. What makes her interesting is that she seems exotic. There's an exoticism to her English accent that makes her seem even more extraordinary, otherworldly.
Oh, yeah.
Manufactured through the science and all that. So that's something to keep in mind, okay? And remember, there's a scene in particular where they have a conversation with her about sex.
Right.
And you remember what they were saying in that conversation?
I don't really remember the conversation, but I do remember the scene.
Okay, I mean, basically, in the scene, they talk about how they can't get laid. There's a confession there that they essentially could never get a girl as hot as her. And what ends up happening, again, this is the fetishization of women that we oftentimes see, is that you want her to be your lover and her mother. I mean, that's just true. There's that element. And what's interesting is that, first of all, these teenagers are around 15, 16...
They're in high school, somewhere between 15 and 17. So,
here's the thing about it. She's not. The character she plays is somebody at least in her 20s. And, she's, in other words, the exoticism of being, quote unquote, being with an older woman. A woman who is highly sexually desirable, who would introduce them to the world of sex, somebody who would break them in. Is that fair? I mean...
That is very fair to say.
I mean, this is the thing that I think people forget about this movie, is that this movie fetishizes not only her as a female, but it also fetishizes the idea of having an older woman be attracted to you. And that's something to keep in mind. Okay? And again, she doesn't have a real character. Let me just quote one of the lines from the movie, okay? You guys created me. I didn't come from anywhere. Before you started messing around with your computer, I didn't even exist. By the way, you did an excellent job. Thank you. In other words, you made me really hot. You made me really banging. So, thank you for that. I mean, essentially, her entire character, is her being hot. And also, she's also somebody who can be sassy. Again, this fascination of creating this fictionalized character. A sassy, foreign-sounding hot girl, a hot adult woman, right?
Oh yeah.
I can be a real bitch if I don't get what I want.
Yep.
Is actually one of the lines from the movie.
Yep.
I mean, that's extraordinary. Okay? And that's something to keep in mind when you think about a lot of these sci-fi comedies and teenage comedies, is the fetishization of the idealized woman. There's a fixation on having and creating that character within science. You see it again and again. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about a slightly different film, which was a huge hit, and it comes out about the same time period. I mean, you got within 2 years, 84, 85. Ghostbusters, Weird Science, and this one, Back to the Future. Now, let's get into that. What is this film?
It is by Robert Zemeckis. He co-wrote it with Bob Gale. Robert Zemeckis also directed this. It stars Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd. And it is about this crazy mad scientist whose only goal ever was to travel back to the past. And he found the perfect vessel with a DeLorean. Because everyone knows they can't go 88 miles per hour.
Well, that's fascinating. But the DeLorean, and by the way, the history of John DeLorean is one you guys, if you never read anything about DeLorean, you should totally look him up. He had one of those lives and careers that that itself should just makes almost a fictional movie. You can't imagine that this guy was real, but he was. And he wanted to create the car of the future. That's actually what the car was meant to be. It was meant to be the car of the future.
Yes.
It has like wings as if it could fly type of thing.
As he said, I want the car of the 2000s.
I want the car of the 2000s. Exactly right. Okay. So the basic premise is the scientist wants to go back in time using this DeLorean as a time machine. Now it stars, however, not just Christopher Lloyd, but one
Michael J. Fox.
Well, why is that significant?
Because at this time, Michael J. Fox was actually, in his career, he was a child actor, of course.
Mm-hmm, right.
But he hadn't really broken out into mainstream Hollywood yet.
No, he was emerging. He was coming out with some hit films at this time, though. He does Teen Wolf.
Yes.
Back to the Future, of course, was a mega success and one of the big things. Now, this again brings us to the socially alienated outsider, which is interesting because here he is. He's a guy who loves rock and roll. He's a teenager. He loves skateboarding again, which is meant to identify him as being quote unquote cool. Because in 1985, if you skateboard, you were cool. And also, the skateboard was considered to be, I think it's fair to say, kind of a symbol of
the punk
the
uprising,
rebel. I don't play by your rules, Dad, kind of thing. I mean, it's meant to be. So they use those kind of social cues to show that he's an outsider. And of course, one of the big scenes to indicate that is his love of rock and roll, which is ironic, considering that rock and roll had been around now for over 30 years at this point. But there's that big moment in the film, you remember?
Oh, yes.
The rock band?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Basically, when he travels back to the past.
No, before that.
Oh.
No, go with the first one, because that's what makes it interesting. Remember when he's trying out the band?
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
He's trying to do a garage band.
Well, yeah. Well, what happens basically is that he has this band. It's a rock band, and by the way, kind of, contemporary, boring rock music. To be honest with you, nondescript rock music. But they want to try out an audition for the school dance.
Yes.
And every year they get rejected. So this year they come in full suit and ties.
Yep.
And they play the rock music, and all the most stuffy, uninteresting, by the way, unattractive teachers. I'm sorry, I no disrespect to the actors, but let's be real. And basically, they're rejected out of hand.
Yes,
because they like rock music. Again, this idea of the teenager being the outsider because of who he is, and just the nature of his character. There's this unbridgeable gap between the generations.
Yes, that is correct. And another thing that makes him the outsider is basically his only friend is this old mad scientist.
That's the other thing that's interesting about that is that the character that's created has a very small social world. You get to know very little about him. Zemeckis, as a writer, keeps heavy-handed control over his character to ensure that he has no random engagements with anybody unless that person can tell you something about Michael J. Fox's character within the story. So you have, for example, his family. His family is full of losers, people who are themselves social outcasts and outsiders who are bullied routinely.
Right.
By the way, some very excellent actors that include Leah Thompson, Crispin Glover.
Yep. Crispin
Glover. The one highlight, I should say, was, of course, the Elizabeth Shue character. Now, but it wasn't Elizabeth Shue in the original. It wasn't Elizabeth Shue. She was recast.
Yes. I can't think of the actress's name.
It's but I can't think of the time. But anyway, he has this seemingly well-adjusted, attractive girlfriend. Let's put it that way. Okay. Which seems the one kind of bizarre false note to me in the story, that he has this attractive character, he has this attractive girlfriend, because I don't know where she's coming from at all, because he's got no social life or activity outside of what we are being presented, and it's a little bit of a bizarre note, as if to make him sound like no, Marty McFly, which is the character's name he plays, is a normal guy. He has a heterosexual relationship with this girl.
Which is kind of weird with all the time he spent with the professor.
Claudia Wells.
Oh, yep, that is correct.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I was really surprised when I rewatched this movie as an adult, because I'm going, he's spending a lot of time with the mad scientist, yet he has a girlfriend. I didn't think he played that way.
Well, that's because the problem is you don't really know his relationship with Doc Brown.
You really don't.
Christopher Lloyd. It seems that it's the one place where he can be himself without being judged.
Right.
Because Lloyd's character, Doc Brown, what makes Doc Brown such a likable character is that he doesn't judge anybody.
No.
Because it's clear because he's been judged all of his life for being a crackpot and whatever.
And that's why he lost all of his money.
Yeah.
Is because he was investing in inventions that he was creating, yet no one was willing to back him because he looked crazy.
Yeah, he was, or they were not very good. I mean, well, you have a lot of failures as a scientist, you know?
Yep.
Again, that's another thing. Again, going back to this theme, within these 1980s sci-fi comedies is, and this is an important distinction, and I want to bring up to the 2000s, is the 1980s was still in that generation from the 50s. You have to remember, the 50s to the 80s was of a distinct generation where science was still an unknown element that was largely unintegrated into our lives. It was just not as commonplace to have as many technologies as we do today. So scientific breakthroughs were considered phenomenal, where every year you have a new cell phone, or every year you have a new computer that does this, that, and the other. The computers of today are 3 times faster than the computers of the 1990s. I'm just, or I'll be honest with you, why 20 times faster if I'm really going to be honest with you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? But I'm saying the weakest and cheapest laptop you could buy today, because think about the crappiest laptop you can buy today, holds much more storage and is much faster and more efficient than any computer on the planet in the 1960s. Any.
The whole room computer.
Well, yeah, they had a lot of space. I mean, they needed a lot of space for these computers. Here's the point. The proliferation of technology and scientific data that is easily available at our fingertips, that's not just found within the scientific community, within libraries, laboratories, that's where all that data was found. With the mass publication of online articles, journals, things like that, online media.
Right.
You have these TED Talks, everything. The proliferation of science within the communities has made science an everyday phenomenon. And I think that's important to remember. That science was considered extraordinary. You didn't have to explain, therefore, science, because you already didn't know anything anyway, unless you were part of that very small, select community.
Right.
Where today, if you try to do a movie with science, they either are going to excoriate you for not getting the science correct, or they're going to embrace you for how scientifically accurate the film is. That's just what it is. We're going to be talking about science and film later on, the relationship between the two, and we're actually going to be bringing some scientists into the session to actually discuss it for a later session, so keep watch out for that. That'll be an interesting conversation because I've found that scientists have very strong opinions about movies involving science. Big shock. But again, that notion of teenage alienation, the stereotyping of science. Again, science is a MacGuffin for redemption. Doc Brown's redemption, Michael J. Fox, who goes back in time, actually, and what's the basic premise of him going back in time?
Basically, he goes back into time with Christopher Lloyd, and they can't get back. So it's a race of them trying to fix the DeLorean so that they can travel back to their
But what's
current
one of the
time.
big wrinkles? One of the big wrinkles in that?
Michael J. Fox decided it'd be fun to meet his mother.
I don't know. Well, one of the big things in it is that basically he becomes involved in the relationship between his mother and his father, and because of the misadventures he has in the past, he may end up not letting them be together to procreate and have children, which would mean he'd be a dead duck. So he has to do everything possible to help them. And what's interesting about that is that he ends up being the cool character in the 1950s in a way that he is not necessarily in the 1980s shown. Okay? You never see him as cool in the 1980s. He is cool bringing 1980s attitude into a 1950s world.
Right.
And what makes this interesting is that the adult characters that you saw in the 1980s are playing now quote-unquote young teenage versions, are considered to be dorks. Leah Thompson's character, Crispin Glover, the losers that they are in the 80s are the dorks in the 1950s, and what he tries to do is, essentially, when he's back there, is redeem them and make them successful, make them great.
Yes.
You know, but that's again something that's again drawing from the values of the 1980s. That you can always reimagine yourself. You can create a false image of yourself. Okay, this is the age of where people were getting breast implants, people were getting facelifts, people were doing a lot of plastic surgery, people were remaking themselves in very, very radical ways. Again, this notion of reinvention of self. That you can slough off everything that's undesirable. And what's undesirable in this case is that geek culture. And he's going to fix them. There's nothing wrong with them. They're perfectly good people. They have good hearts. They live good lives. They don't have any drug problems. They don't have any big problems. They don't have drinking problems. They don't have any problems, really.
Right.
They don't have any problems. But because they're nerdy, they need to be repaired.
Yep.
He has to fix them. And again, that's a commentary on the culture of the 1980s. That geeks care about science. Geeks can find a way to be successful by stop being geeks.
By being something that is a complete lie to their character.
Well, yeah. To divorce themselves from reality. I mean, you see that a lot in films.
Oh, yes.
And films in the 70s and 80s. Grease is probably one of the greatest violators of that principle. And I like Grease, don't get me wrong, I'm actually a big fan of musicals, but the reality is that they throw away who they are to become something else for mass appeal. And so, the science here, such as it is again for self-interest.
Yes.
It has no value as actual science. It's a MacGuffin.
Yep.
Okay? I mean, what else can we say about Back to the Future in this regard, do you think?
It was really a movie about an old mad scientist trying to make money. And he was hoping this great new invention that would take people back in time would make him a lot of money.
But also validate him. There's a sense of redemption and validation. Remember, there's a great scene when Marty McFly, that's the character played by
Michael J. Fox.
And Fox meets the early version of Christopher Lloyd's character, and when Christopher Lloyd finds out he's from the future, and that something he actually did worked, there's such a joy in that character's moment, validation.
Oh, yes.
Okay, because I think part of it's not just about the money. I think part of it's about the validation. I think he takes such stupid-ass risks.
Oh, yeah.
Because partly what he does in the 1980s when he's trying to create the DeLorean time machine is he steals fuel from terrorists.
Yes.
I don't think a man risked all that just for the money. I think he risked it because he wants to be validated as somebody of worth to the larger community. Maybe the money's part of that, but I think it's about because I think all of his life he's been thought of as a loser, an outsider, as a failure.
So what I'm hearing is you're saying that he wants to be validated by the scientific community once again like he used to be.
I don't know if it's even the scientific, going back to your point, I don't even know if it's the scientific community he wants to be validated by.
Okay.
Because I think a time machine would just be world famous.
It would be.
It would be everybody. You'd be meeting the president. I think he just wants to be validated by people as a great person.
Right.
As a great scientist. Because there's no mention of the scientific community is never mentioned in this film or any of the sequels.
It is not.
There is no point where he goes and tries to embrace the scientific community and they reject him. The scientific community has no place in sci-fi films. They just don't. Because then you would have to validate the science.
Right.
And we can't have that science crap get in the way of the comedy. You know?
True. That would just bog everything down.
It would. I mean, so let's be very clear here. The science plays no real role as science. It's, again, a narrative tool. It is a vehicle for the comedy, but also for these themes of self-aggrandizement, self-interest, redemption, and commentary on nerd culture. I would say, in the 1980s.
I would agree.
I mean, that's the thing. Now, we're going to switch gears, okay? We want to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about some remaining films for the rest of our time that take on a different beat in two ways. The first one the first films we're going to talk about are films that use science purely for comedic purpose to talk about human foible. Okay? And we're going to talk about a couple of those types of movies, and then we're going to talk about the how science can play a role in social commentary, even within comedies. Okay? So let's start first with just pure, science being used for pure comedic fodder, and that would include Spaceballs, made in 1987. Tell us about this movie, Cody.
It was written and directed by Mel Brooks. It stars Bill Pullman, John Candy, Mel Brooks, and Rick Moranis. And it is a complete parody of the Star Wars films.
It's a parody of Star Wars. Now, itself, Star Wars, of course, was not science fiction. It's not. That's some people think it's science fiction. It's not. And by the way, it doesn't claim to be either. It's actually science fantasy.
Yes.
And there's a big difference between the two. And maybe someday we'll get into what those things are. But Spaceballs essentially, what role does science, and what do I mean by science? In other words, the use of experimentation, method to create new technologies, new ideas to examine, explain, and help the world, or understand the world or universe better. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about science. So how does it use those themes?
It really doesn't. It uses sciences. I don't believe it does.
I would say it does. I think it does in a beautiful way, because the whole idea of the film is a commentary. First of all, it goes back to commentary. The film is about getting fresh air.
Yep.
So in the previous decade, we were passing laws on fresh water, fresh air. Smog was a huge problem in the 80s. It's hard for people to imagine how bad the smog situation was in Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. You just couldn't see. Your eyes burned. Your eyes literally would be burning from smog. So fresh air was a rarity. Fresh water was becoming increasingly scarce as chemicals were being dumped into our rivers and everything. That was a huge deal. And so everybody in the scientific community started racing around thinking, what can we do to fix this problem? What can we do? How can we fix it? Right? So the whole premise, it's MacGuffin, but the premise of the story is based on what? Do you remember?
The whole premise is basically save the princess, save the universe.
No, remember. Why do they want... Okay, what happens... We have this basically evil empire, like you do in Star Wars, right? They kidnap the princess of a specific planet, and what do they want from them? You remember? They want their heir.
Oh, that's right.
They want their heir.
Yep.
That's the whole point.
Yep.
They kidnap the princess to get their access because they want their planet. And the reason they want their planet is they don't want their culture, they don't want their money, they don't want their houses, they don't give a crap about anything. They want a clean, fresh environment.
Right.
Coming out in the 1970s, that totally made sense to a 1987 audience who lived in garbage-filled cities.
Right.
Where there was smog, smoke, sickness, illness, where the environment was wretching itself every day. The idea of stealing somebody's land in, by the way, American culture is not a new idea. Oh, wait, you've got nice land. Not anymore!
We traded for it.
Yeah, sure, right. Yeah, I give you bullets. Anyway, but here's the point. So basically they want to steal land. Very 19th century America and 20th century America way of going. There's in other words, there's an imperialist element. They want the resources for their own purposes.
Right.
Fresh air is such a luxury, and this is one of the jokes in the movie that's fantastic. The movie has 100 jokes, and they're all terrific jokes in my opinion. But one of the big jokes is you can buy different types of air. Like you can buy different types of sodas.
Yes.
You can buy salt air, fresh air, sea air. You can buy any type of air you want. Mountain air. Okay? So you can buy all this luxury air you want, and it comes in a Coke can that you crack open and you sniff it, and and you're getting high from it almost, because the air in the universe is so stale and almost puerile. It's just awful. But fresh air is the luxury. It's the fine wine of the universe at that point, basically.
Oh yeah.
So in other words, there's an air industry. Now again, that's the kind of the joke and vehicle that works off of. Most of it is about saving the princess, like in Star Wars. But the point is that again, it starts off with that social commentary about what our communities look like, how they're behaving, and again, in this case, a lot of the scientific jokes are centered around American culture at that time.
Yes.
The proliferation of different types of sodas and drinks and whatever. The use of different types of weapons that were developing coming out of the Star Wars program. I mean, what would you say the role of science is in Spaceballs outside of those?
It is basically just a vehicle of how people are transporting, and it's also a source of getting to know the characters. Like, everyone in the spaceships, they're constantly talking and interacting with each other, so
these enforced communities.
Yeah, it really is a forced community, and you actually get to witness these people's personality for the first time.
Right. And again, Mel Brooks, who is this old-style comedian from the 50s, he really is. He's an old-style Sid Caesar comedian from the 1950s, who grew up watching mostly horror films and adventure films in his youth. That was his big thing.
He was a huge fan of the 1930s horror films.
Big fan of the 30s horror films. He didn't grow up embracing or interested in science. And so everything in the science that occurs within the movie is unexplained, again, and just exists for a joke. And actually, what's interesting about the film, and this may say something about Mel Brooks, is that oftentimes their engagement with the technology is faulty.
Yes.
They don't know how to use the technology in which they are put in charge of. So, one of the actors' name is Rick Moranis, an excellent actor, huge in the 1980s, and he plays the Darth Vader character. He plays a comedic version of a Darth Vader type character. And a number of the jokes center around his inability to use the technology well. Okay? I mean, you remember the big scene with the light speed?
Yes.
I mean, in that scene, you basically have different types of speeds. You remember what there was? Hold on. There was ridiculous, ludicrous speed.
Wasn't there super hyper speed? Wasn't that the third one?
I can't remember what there was. But the point is that there's these different speeds, and when they go ludicrous speed, he realizes that he's made a terrible mistake ordering them to go ludicrous speed because they're almost being killed by it. So again, it's this guy who has no understanding of the technology, but he's going to use it anyway. He's going to use it because why the heck not, right? I'm going to use this technology and abuse it even though I'm not very good at it.
It's basically, here's a red button, don't push it. Well, I'm going to push it.
And so you have the science in this case plays more of a role of making people look like incompetent morons than it is to actually help to facilitate their success. Is that fair enough to say?
That is fair to say.
I mean, the science in it does very little good for anybody and does more harm. And what it really speaks to is the fact that nobody understands the science.
No, not at all.
Nobody understands how it works. And that people at that time, particularly in that time period, had very little interest in understanding how the scientific community operated and what they could draw and what benefits they could draw from new sciences, new technologies. Those things were not as sought after as they are today. I mean,
that is correct.
There's a joke that's done in the movie where basically there's a radar technician that talks about how the radar works.
Yep.
I mean, you go ahead and you talk about that scene with the sound. Remember the sound guy? You got the beeps, the creeps.
Oh, I can't remember the exact wording.
But
for that.
basically, he ends up talking about the different types of sounds that occur within it. Okay, that you have the creeps. What was it? The creeps, the meeps, something like that.
The bleeps.
Oh yeah, it was the bleeps,
the sweeps, and the creeps.
And there's the attached scene in it where he talks about these things and plays them out. And it's a fabulous scene. Again, these are movies that we would all recommend. All these movies we've mentioned are a lot of fun, great times. You've not seen them, totally check them out. I absolutely adore them. Spaceballs is a huge fun movie. And in this case, with the radar guy, who was a huge hit, this guy was a very popular comedian in the 80s. And he does these things talking about how, describing a radar as the sweeps, the bleeps,
in the creeps.
And the creeps makes no freaking sense at all. But what's great about it is that that's what we think of when we think of radars. We're like, oh, okay, it's sweeping back and forth. Okay, it's making a beep. Okay.
And there's something creeping in the corner.
Creeping in the corner. So, it's again, there is no interest in understanding the actual science. It's just using it for as fodder for their own purposes. Okay. Now, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about. Excuse me. Let's talk about the film Short Circuit. Okay, Short Circuit, 1986. Okay, here's again the use of technology to create a robot weapon, actually.
Yes.
That actually becomes self-aware. He names himself Johnny Five. And this movie stars Steve Guttenberg and Ali Sheedy, who were huge. Believe it or not, they were huge at that time. Yes, there was an Steve Guttenberg. You wanted to have Steve Guttenberg in a movie. That was a thing.
Thank you, Police Academy.
Yeah, there's so many things. Cocoon. But basically, the film is how this self-aware robot that was meant to be used as a death machine doesn't want to be violent. He wants to live in his own independent life. So he hooks up with two, social outsiders who agree to protect him from the military. And the military is the worst kind of stereotype military possible. Of vicious, cruel men, who are bent on using technology for one end, the destruction of other human beings. Is that fair enough to say?
That is fair enough to say, and they are very stereotypical military men. Like, we don't care what the public's opinion is. This is what we're going to do.
And again, part of that certainly comes out of that era. This is 1986, so this is in the wake of Iran-Contra. And that idea that the military, CIA, and other people were engaging activities that were sub rosa and were shameful and potentially embarrassing to the country, and were engaging in creating new technology. And a lot of this was lampooning the Reagan administration. And the actor at the time who actually, if you wanted to have the most stereotypical type of actor play a military man, the guy who was your boy was a guy by the name of George W. Bailey. George W. Bailey, back in the 1980s, he played the lieutenant, commandant, whatever you wanted. If you wanted the guy to play a cruel, mean, vicious commander, he was your boy. But he always did it in comedies because he didn't play a realistic character. He always played a kind of a parody, a setup. Okay? He was the guy that you were made to dislike, and he represented all the bad things about the military. That was the stereotyping of his character. And so even the casting of such a man would have tipped off the audience about what kind of character we were getting. Okay, that's not something that's as true today with stars, but back in the 1980s, the type of stars that you cast told you more and more about what type of movie you were making. And Johnny Five, you get these people who are the cool kind of social outsiders, and Steve Guttenberg as an actor, now just as an actor, whether you think his movies are good or not, was always playing a little bit of the rebel, okay, until the 1990s. Ali Sheedy always played the social outsider throughout the 1980s, and even into the 1990s. She always kind of played the social outsider kind of role. So you knew with their casting exactly what you were going to get. And Johnny Five presents this opportunity for the science again to serve as a MacGuffin for them as social outsiders to find meaning and purpose in their lives.
Right.
Okay. You also see this with a film like Flight of the Navigator. Also the same year. Remember the Flight of the Navigator?
Not really. That's stretching.
No, this one, let's talk. Well, I mean, basically it's 1986, and the kid who disappears for 8 years.
Right.
From 1978, wakes up in 1986, and he ends up being the only one who can fly the spaceship.
Right.
Because he has all the technology in his head. But basically, again, it was a boy who felt lost, disaffected from his family, finding a home with these aliens on a spaceship. These robots on a spaceship.
Right.
And so a lot of these movies dealt with that sense of redemption yet again. But they would do it to a larger comedic purpose. Johnny Five is very goofy. It's not quite Spaceballs level, but it certainly comes up to a level of a lot of hijinks and pratfalls and things like that. That's fair enough to say, right?
Oh, yeah, and I can't remember who the director was, but I do remember reading an interview with him, and he said...
Well, I'll tell you, it's John Badham.
Oh, okay.
It's John Badham. John Badham had a storied career for a long time and did maybe some of the bigger movies in the 1980s. He was the director of Saturday Night Fever.
Yep.
He had directed War Games, one of my favorite movies from the 1980s. I absolutely adore adore that movie. He'd done Blue Thunder, which was a well-received movie. He did the American version of Point of No Return. So he was a director that was, if not beloved, he was respected. Let's put it that way. And so he was ideal for this type of material in the 1980s. But we're going to switch gears now. We're going to talk about films that are very much directed towards social commentary, starting with what I believe is one of Cody's beloved films. And I'm going to let him talk about it, the John Carpenter film.
They Live.
Now, is this really science fiction?
It has science fiction elements.
Okay.
It is a John Carpenter film, so there are horror elements also.
Well, he did a lot of non-horror films.
He did.
He did Assault on Precinct 13, which I love.
Oh, that's a great movie.
Yeah, but that's not a horror movie.
Not at all.
I mean, I guess you stretch the term horror, you could say it is, because it's like a home invasion movie.
Well, with that one, if you look how it's filmed with some of the action sequences, it is filmed like a traditional John Carpenter horror film.
Okay. Well, so what's the setup for this film, and why would you consider it a sci-fi comedy?
I consider it a sci-fi comedy personally because of Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper is, if you don't know, he was a WWF, WWE wrestler.
Wannabe actor.
Wannabe actor. He wasn't very good at acting. He was very good at being sarcastic.
Yeah.
And he was very good at fight scenes.
He was more personality than he was person, at least for me.
And what happens in this film is basically he's just going through his life being the outcast. He likes drinking. He likes chewing bubble gum. He doesn't like anyone. And so one day he bumps into a person and they drop their sunglasses and he goes to give it back to them.
Sure.
And they don't respond. So he puts them on and realizes some of the people are really ugly. And then as he's looking around, he sees more people like this. And he's going...
So what happened to them?
Basically, it was an alien invasion.
Exactly. Yeah, alien invasion, and he puts on the sunglasses, and now he's taking it... Well, he takes it upon himself to do what?
To take care of the issue.
Well, how does he do... What do you mean?
He grabs a shotgun. He grabs a stick of bubble gum.
As all well-adjusted people do when the alien invasion occurs.
And then he just walks into a random bank and says, I'm here to chew bubble gum and kick some and start shooting. Because that's Roddy Piper. Action first, question later.
What's the science aspect to this? Let's get into that.
Now, the science aspect of it is how the aliens have slowly integrated into American culture.
How does that work?
They officially set up their own satellites.
Okay.
Which allowed them to broadcast TV with filters on so it looks like a human
Exactly.
host.
And that's a big deal. Is the use of media, and this is where it is, the technology, and this is why this makes this a very good Cold War commentary film. One of the reasons I appreciate this film so much is very Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, towards the end of the Cold War.
Yes,
it's
tail end of it.
Yeah, it's using the use of technology as a means by which to infiltrate and inculcate oneself into a society and culture. And it really deals with paranoia. And the use of technology to suss out the true enemies. Because that was the belief. The belief has always been, and you see this today, guys, don't kid yourself. We use technology as a way to suss out people who are considered to be pedophiles, criminals, recidivists, drug addicts. We use technology to root out, quote-unquote, people that we find to be undesirable, denying them opportunities. People that we say look like everybody else, but are, quote-unquote, what? Different. Okay. We've seen this with controversies over immigration. We see this over controversy over American nationalism. These issues appear again and again. The use of technology to influence perception. You know?
And John Carpenter even said, I wrote this as a commentary on the spy industry.
He did. He absolutely
Because he was afraid that the media was overtaken by the Russians at one point.
And also the use of misinformation, which was a common Cold War tactic. Misinformation was oftentimes relayed by people within the Americans, the Russians, Brits, other people, as a way to undermine policy within certain countries or leaders. Let's keep that in mind. So the movie itself talks about how you have the existence of the quote-unquote the other misdirecting, misinforming, and destroying America, not from the outside, but from
within.
What's interesting about the Carpenter film, particularly given Carpenter's history, is that it's a profoundly conservative message.
It is.
For that time period, okay?
Very much so.
Whether you think so it is or now, regardless, it is for that time period because there was still a strong anti-Russian bias.
Yes.
Okay? But when you watch this film, and yes, it has these gnarly elements that are violent and some vulgarish elements and...
A 15-minute fight scene.
15-minute fight scene, one of the longest fight scenes in film history, in fact. What makes this film an important commentary is that the use of scientific technology becoming used for everyday purposes of changing and influencing people's minds. We've seen that just recently in the past decade with things like Cambridge Analytica. Creating narratives and sections of people with mindsets and agendas. And that's part of what the magic is to this movie, is that the movie shows that what if you could put on glasses and see exactly what everyone was? That waving above their heads was a title. Murderer, abuser, illegal immigrant, whatever their title was above their heads. That's important because it would change the way you interact with the world profoundly. Who you spoke with, how you dealt with them. The Rowdy Roddy Piper character is again a very conservative character because he deals with it using violence. He's one man against the world. That extraordinary individualism. Which, by the way, was very true to Rowdy Roddy Piper's character, in person.
Yes.
In life, he believed himself to be a hero amongst boys. Amongst boys. He really had that attitude, okay? And that's not a fault, I'm saying, but it fit very well with the conservative messaging that is in the film. That notion of extraordinary individualism to take on the invaders. This is a profound counterpoint to a horror film that's done in the 1950s, which is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which has a very different messaging as opposed to this one. And that's something to keep in mind. So the use of science to suss out the other and the different, the threatening, is an important thing, particularly today. Even more so, I would say today. I think this movie resonates even more today in that regard.
Oh, I agree.
Than it does in 88. Because of the proliferation of technology where you can find out anything about anybody.
Yes.
Where the glasses
are the screen now.
Are the screen. It's everything. It's the television. It's the internet. It's the laptop. It's the the phone. It's everything. So keep in mind that even though this may be considered comedic in some ways, sci-fi comedies themselves were oftentimes commentaries on real issues, negative, positive, conservative, liberal, however you want to interpret it, but real life issues that were existing within that time period, and some of which still transcend to this day. Spaceballs works as a comedy, as a social commentary, in part because of its environmental messaging. They Live speaks about notions of otherness and how we identify them, how we characterize them. The fact that they're ugly Cody mentioned that they look ugly. That was not meant to just be literal. It's metaphorical. They're meant to be, they are ugly because they don't represent ourselves. And that's something to keep in mind in these social commentaries. Anyway, before we wrap up, any other thoughts that we had?
I think we covered everything
I know we covered a lot of stuff. But sci-fi comedy in the 1980s is a unique animal that engages with social issues of the 1980s. It deals with the attempts to appeal to the teenage audience and the stereotyping of the teenage audience in a way that you don't see as much today. At least not in film.
Not at this time, but I think with the rise of shows like Rick and Morty and Orville that we might see sci-fi comedy make a comeback to the big screen.
You think so?
I think so.
I think those things are so good that they make it harder. Because
you think so?
Yeah, because I don't think why go to the movie? If I can get 30 episodes of Rick and Morty, why am I going to wait 6 months to go see a 2-hour movie? And can it be sustained for 2 hours? Particularly when we know that generationally, the attention span of generations are getting shorter.
Yet they keep releasing these 3+ hour movies like...
And that's the thing, though, is that in the wake of that, all the other movies are getting killed.
Yes.
And these longer movies now are being considered event, cannot miss, must see, Barnum and Bailey types of extravaganzas.
Right.
And that's wiping out movies like they used to be the 86-minute movie,
right.
the hour movie, the 69-minute movie, the 90-minute movie, the 2-hour movie now. You know? And we have to question whether or not those movies need to be that long anyway, but that's a whole other conversation. Anyway, thanks a lot, guys, for listening. I'm Rod Monte.
I'm Cody Matushik.
And we are the Movie Reviewers.